All right, so we're beginning 14.2, and our topic here is going to be homosexuality. Just as a um, warning in the beginning, we are going to be incorporating some language as far as what you would hear in your LGBTQ community. Understand that that's not meant to be crude or anything else like that. So if you do get uncomfortable, I apologize in advance. You know, it's one of those things where in order to become familiar with this, we really have to take a step back and really chew on some things. For some of you guys, you may find this topic a little bit uncomfortable. It's a talk about sex and sexuality. Obviously, that's incredibly personal. And so it should be, in all honesty, a little bit uncomfortable to talk about because what you're doing is you're talking about how God created it at sexuality is very much God created and it's very intimate. And so anytime you do have those uncomfortable feelings, understand that in all honesty, that's actually probably very good because we're talking about you being made in the image of God and about how Satan comes in and twists that. It's incredibly personal. So if you do get uncomfortable, don't feel bad about that. Just because it's it's just the nature of what it is. But because it's so personal, obviously that shows how vulnerable and the significance of sex and sexuality to Jesus Christ and the symbology that goes into it. Obviously, it should really make sense as far as how vulnerable um, that this topic is to being twisted by sin and why it's being so, I guess, targeted, if you will, uh, by um, by Satan. So just keep that in mind as we're going through it. If you're having a hard time, obviously pause it, come back to it. If you need to skip, then I guess go ahead and skip or just read through the notes if you, don't want to hear me talking about the sensitive subject. But that's just a little bit of a disclaimer in the front. So important vocabulary that you need to know. You have queer theory, and that's simply the study of homosexuality. You have this term fag, and that's, in all honesty, guys, it's a very demeaning and offensive term, especially towards your male homosexuals. Be careful about your language, guys, because your vocabulary, you never know whenever somebody is struggling with their sexuality, and you could unfortunately cause some real spiritual damage or compromise your testimony as a Christian just by your language. I don't care if you think everyone in the room is a Christian. Just because somebody's a Christian doesn't mean that at one point or another, or even currently, that they struggle with their sexuality. Be very careful about making assumptions. Another vocabulary, obviously, your LGBT, and obviously now it's LGBTQ, and what that Q stands for is questioning. And then you have orthodox, and this is basically the established traditional mainstream view. So like Orthodox Christianity, it's the established traditional mainstream theology that you would find represented in the Christian church that is all agreed upon. Okay, so when we're looking at the history of homosexuality, June 26th is an incredibly important date. So the issue of homosexuality is primarily an issue of sin that must be addressed by the gospel. So it can't be ignored as a political issue that must be addressed in the public square. So from a biblical perspective, when you look at June 26th, it's a date that will live on very famously because of the historical magnitude of the various attempts to overthrow God's creational norms for marriage. So what happened on June 26th? Well, the Supreme Court struck down state laws prohibiting sodomy. And so, so you have 10 years later, then again, you have where the court struck down a key part of the defense of marriage. And then 2 years later, on June 26, 2015, June 26, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of legalizing gay marriage in all 50 states. So each of these rulings was made in spite of the vigorous dissent of several of the Supreme Court justices. So there's a lot of derision, a lot of conflicts even within the Supreme Court. And so what you have is you have obviously this non-bipartisan agreement where you have a viewpoint being pushed. And so each of these were incredibly important whenever you look at the historical meanings as far as your LGBTQ community goes. So the gay Christian movement is another big movement that you need to be aware of that is actually going on currently. So your gay Christian movement argues that the Bible is God's holy word and that it has nothing negative to say about faithfully monogamous homosexuals. So monogamous vocab, it's all about the vocabulary here, guys. Monogamous means marrying and staying sexually faithful to one partner. And a lot of times whenever when you do talk to somebody from the gay Christian movement, they're very much for the gospel and, Jesus's love. But one of their key, and they have a lot of different key arguments, but one of their key arguments that they use is that, well, Jesus never directly said anything against homosexuality. And if Jesus didn't say it, then it's not so. And so there are a few different arguments out there for the gay Christian movements. If you have time, go and Google it. If we were in classes, it would be something that we would dive into a little bit more. There are a lot of interesting viewpoints out there. So if you have time, research that. It is really interesting to see the different perspectives that are actually being represented in the current Christian church that are disputed. And so, you're going to have a lot of different perspectives. It's not, even at a conservative church, you'll have one person who may have grown up in a very liberal home. And so, even at Hillside, this is probably one of our constant conversations, this issue of sex and sexuality that we find at every single level, from youth ministry and all the way up through adults. And really it's just about, okay, well, how did people grow up? And so I guarantee you probably have a few of these philosophies that will tie back to the gay Christian movement in your church, or at least that influence someone in your church in some way or another. So how do we respond to these two movements? I guess so. The gay Christian movement and and then your court rulings, your politics. How do you respond to that from a CFR perspective? Well, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what does the Bible reveal to be God's created order for marriage? All right. So if you're going to respond to these philosophies, you need to know your stuff. All right. So here's some key points in response to this question. First, God created humans to intimately unite according to their creative, God-given, and patently recognizable complementary genders. All right, so it's that topic of genders again. Next, even after the fall, God's recognizable created order still remains. All right, marriage is a covenant, and we talked about the significance of covenants, witnessed and ratified by God to make a husband and wife one for the purpose of procreating. And last, marriage was designed to picture two distinct entities, Christ and the church. This picture cannot be portrayed when the two entities are the same. And you can see Wesley Whetstone left me a little thing right there. All right, so another question to consider is, what does the Bible reveal to be Fall's effect on sexuality? Well, anytime same-sex sexual intimacy, or any same-sex sexual intimacy is going to be fallen, because the act in it of itself contradicts God's design of the natural order. And so whenever we use the word natural here, understand that we're referring to God's design, not to the natural desires of fallen humans contaminated by original sin. So it's how God created us, not what we are now after the fall. All right, so that's incredibly important to understand that terminology, and that's a really hard word that a lot of people that are pro LGBTQ, they really distaste that word. But that's how we perceive it. So whenever you're talking about natural, it's about how God designed it to be originally before the fall. All right, so what does the Bible reveal to be the fall's effect on sexuality? All right, continuing on. All right, so people can't claim to be saved with the hope of inheriting God's kingdom if they persist in unrepentant sin. All right, so homosexual practice is one example of lawless rebellion that is contrary to the sound doctrine and to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're going to go into this in a little bit, but whenever it comes to same-sex attraction, homosexually oriented, homosexually practicing, and all that, there's a difference between someone who struggles with same-sex attraction versus practicing homosexuals. And so, as far as when is it sin? Is it sinful to harbor same-sex attractions and not act on it? And that's something to chew on. We'll go into that a little bit more. I'll table that question for now. So what does the Bible reveal to be God's redemptive, transformative work in regard to the sexually immoral? Well, believers in the church were once characterized by the practices mentioned in the previous verses, but they no longer practice those sins. All right, so think about that question I just posed. All right, so believers in the church were once characterized by the practices mentioned in the previous verses, but they no longer practice those sins. All right, believers must pursue sanctified living by saying no to their own immoral sexual passions. They must put sin to death. So in that question, as far as is same-sex attraction sinful or the differentiation of the practice of sin, I want you to keep these thoughts in mind, especially whenever you look at believers must pursue sanctified living by saying no, because that is an ongoing action. That isn't in past tense. That is where people are at currently. So it's sanctified living by saying in the present time no to their own immoral sexual passions. So not that those temptations are removed, but some people still have those temptations, and it's about continually saying no and choosing Christ and choosing to pursue sanctification. All right, so let's look at properly defining the same-sex attraction. Well, same-sex attraction should be carefully defined as any erotic or romantic attraction to someone of the same gender. All right, so same-sex attraction should not be confused with legitimate affections of love toward a good friend, sibling, or parent with the same gender. And so, this is actually probably you have this problem currently whenever it comes to defining and differentiating between friends and romantic attraction. And so, because especially with guys, and unfortunately this is really unfair to guys, but there's this idea where this injustice towards guys where, all right, guys are a little too close, and they get teased for having a close friendship when really it's, as far as it being, oh, well, you guys are just, you're in love, or you have this romantic attraction, you guys are too close. And really what it is it's just this friendship. It's a good friend type deal. And that's really unfair to guys that you get teased for that sometimes, because you should be able to have good friends. A lot of the times you hear now for guys who have really great friendship is this idea of bromance. And so where it's not romantic attraction, but there's this obvious closeness between two guys that is non-romantic, non-erotic, and that is okay. That is not same-sex attraction. Same-sex attraction is where you get that eroticism and romanticism involved. And you'll find that even in the LGBTQ community, whenever it comes to this, they'll use people from scripture like David and Jonathan to try to form a basis of argument as far as, oh, well, people in scripture had same-sex attraction. Look at David and Jonathan. Well, no, just the offset of this, guys, that's just a very stereotypical, I guess, gender perspective and the gender stereotype, that as much as they're against gender stereotypes, they're trying to impose their view on scripture. David and Jonathan had a great friendship, but there's nothing in scripture that would say that they had same-sex attraction. And so just keep that in mind if you ever hear that argument. All right, so same-sex attraction should not be confused, because the result is the destruction of good, God-honoring friendships. It does happen with women, but it really does happen a lot with guys. Sorry, guys. It's really unfair to you guys. Because no one wants to be accused of erotic love. You should be able to have confidence in your friendships. So especially as Christians, we should know how to cultivate those deep God-honoring and loving friendships with one another, because there's no such thing as private Christianity. We're called to have relationship with one another, to have that type of friendship and edify one another in Christ. All right, so same-sex attraction should not be confused with superficial cultural traditions, such as men having to love sports. Not all guys like sports, and that's okay. Or women having to cook and sew, and whatever gender stereotype is being pushed on the ladies. And so just because somebody may show a little bit of a gender fluidity towards a gender stereotype. So for example, you have a woman who really likes sports, and she would be considered what a lot of people would deem as a tomboy. That doesn't mean that she would harbor same-sex attractions, or just because a guy likes to dress nice and isn't really into sports, that what culture would deem as a metrosexual, that does not mean that they struggle with same-sex attractions. And you would be surprised at the bullying that takes place. There's a difference between cultural gender norms, if you will, and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily God defined. Yes, God had gender roles that are specific in scripture, but understand is that there is cultural influence on gender. So for example, a gentleman in my church is from the Middle East, and over in the Middle East, the men are in charge of all interior design of the house and running the household. Well, he married an American woman, and so over there, he was the one that did that, and he enforced that, and she was not allowed to do that. But now that they live over in the U.S., guess what happened to the gender stereotype? All right, so they're still happily married, and they still fulfill their gender roles, but there's that cultural influence as far as gender expectations. Another one would be is men in the Middle East. It's not uncommon for them to hold hands, or to give each other a kiss on the cheek. That is not uncommon over there. Uh, However, over here, that would be something that is just like, what's going on? But whenever you look at girls, it's okay for girls to link arms over here. And so understand that just because somebody doesn't necessarily 100% live up to a cultural expectation of what gender should be or look like, that does not mean that they struggle with same-sex attraction. We really have to be careful about that. So, let's see. So here's a question. If a believer experienced same-sex attraction as defined previously, what should he or she do? All right, and I would like you guys to do this. This is going to be an assignment posted in Google Classroom, and it's just graded on completion, so don't forget as far as right or wrong, but I want you guys to chew this over before we move on to the next part. How if a believer experiences same-sex attraction, and I can't tell you, there are a lot of it'll blow your mind how many people do struggle with this same-sex attraction, or at least everyone struggles with sexuality. But what should you do, or what should he or she do? Because a lot of people will, you have culture saying, okay, well, you need to do this. If you struggle with same-sex attraction, then you must live this lifestyle. Well, no, just because you struggle with same-sex attraction does not mean that you have to be gay or that you are gay. And so that's very important for you to understand. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to start here and say, all right, well, you struggle with same-sex attraction. What does Scripture say about this going into it? All right, and so complete this before you go on to the next video.